Hello, you two. So this is an excerpt of the story called A Spot of Fishing, and this is for you to follow along with your transcript for activity 2, and you can see if you can jump in when I miss out any words. How about a spot of fishing today? Asked Mr. Brown at breakfast one. Mr. Brown's query was greeted in various ways by the other members of the family. Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird, anxious glances. Jonathan and Judy let out whoops of delight, while Paddington nearly fell off his seat with excitement. "What are we going for?" asked Mrs. Brown, hoping her husband might suggest something safe near the seashore. "Mackerel," said Mr. Brown vaguely, "or we might even try for some. Anyway, all those in favour raise their right hand." Mr. Brown looked at the response to his idea. "That's 4-2 in favour," "It's 2-all," said Mrs. Bird sternly. "Bears who raise both their paws at the same time are disqualified." "Well, I haven't yet," said Mr. Brown, putting up his own hand, "so that's still 3-2. There's a nice little island just outside he continued. "We can sail out there and make it our base." "Did you say out there, Henry?" asked Mrs. Brown nervously. "That's right," said Mr. Brown. "I met Admiral Grundy just before breakfast, and he's invited us out for the day." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird began to look even less enthusiastic at Mr. Brown's last remark, and even Paddington's whiskers drooped noticeably into his roll and marmalade. Admiral Grundy was a retired English naval officer who lived in a house called the Crow's Nest on the cliffs just outside The Browns had met him on 1 or 2 occasions, and he had a voice like a rusty foghorn, which always made them rather. The first time he had bellowed at them so loudly from the top of the cliff that Mrs. Brown had been quite worried in case there was a fall of rock, and Paddington had dropped an ice cream cone into the sea in his fright. "Been watching you for the last 3 days through my telescope," he'd roared at Mr. Brown. "Knew by your shorts you must be English, though I saw a bear gallivanting about on the beach. Couldn't believe my eyes." "I think his bark's worse than his," said Mr. Brown, "and he seems very keen on our going out with him. I don't suppose he sees many English people now he's retired." Said Mrs. Bird mysteriously. "I can see we've got some preparations to." And with that she left the table and disappeared upstairs, only to return a few minutes later armed with a small parcel which she handed to. "Something told me we might be going sailing," she said. "Sea water makes bears fur. So I made a sea-going outfit before we left, out of one of Jonathan's old cycling." Paddington gasped with astonishment when he untied the parcel and saw what was inside, and everyone stood around admiring while he donned a pair of oilskin leggings and a sou'wester. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Bird," he said gratefully, as he made some final adjustments to his braces. "That settles it," said Mr. Brown. "We shall simply to go sailing now." After they had collected their belongings, the Browns made their way down the winding cobbled street leading to the harbour, and Paddington followed them in a daze. To have one surprise was a nice start to any day, but to be told he was going sailing to have a new outfit at the same time was doubly exciting. Paddington was very keen on boats and harbours, and he liked the one at St. Castile in particular, for it was quite different to anything he had ever seen before in his travels. For one thing, the fishermen used most unusual light nets, which looked very jolly when they were hung out to dry. And even the men themselves were different, for instead of wearing dark blue jerseys and rubber boots like most fishermen, they had red jackets and wooden clogs called sabots. Paddington had spent a lot of his time sitting on the quayside with the Browns, watching the activities in the harbour as the sardine boats came and went, and he was looking forward to the days. Admiral Grundy was already on board his yacht when the Browns, and as they rounded the corner he gave a start and then fixed Paddington with a steely look from beneath his bushy eyebrows. "Shiver me timbers!" he exploded. "What's this? Expecting a gale?" "Shiver your timbers!" Mr. Grundy exclaimed with interest. He peered hard at the Admiral's boat, but it appeared to all be in one piece, and the planks seemed well stuck. "I think he's surprised at your oilskins," whispered, as the Admiral looked up at the sun and then back at Paddington. "My oilskins?" said Paddington hotly, giving the Admiral a hard stare back. "They're some of Mrs. Bird's specials." Recovering himself, the Admiral held out his hand gallantly to Mrs. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he exclaimed. "Hope I haven't offended you. Come along now, women and bears." "You can go up forward, Bear," he said as Paddington clambered aboard. "Keep a sharp lookout and listen for me instructions." After touching the brim of his sou'wester with his paw, Paddington hurried along the deck until he reached the front of the. He wasn't quite sure what he was supposed to look out for, but he felt very pleased he'd brought his opera glasses along, and he spent several moments peering through them at the horizon. We'll stop at that point there. You might have heard some other words that you haven't heard before, like sou'wester. Maybe you could find out what a sou'wester is. We don't really talk about those anymore, do we? And you might be able to make some predictions about what you think might happen next in the rest of the story when Paddington is doing his spot of fishing with the Brown family on holiday.